I'm Kurt from the Post Lounge. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we stand today. I'd like to pay my respects to elders, both past and present, and extend that respect to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islanders in the room. Welcome to Funny Business. I'd like to say big thanks to Binge, who are sponsoring the session. Can we please give it up for Binge? And with no further ado, I'm going to hand it over to today's moderator, the funniest man in the business, Rick Kalowski.
That works. That's good. Everyone, thanks so much for coming. From me as well, thank you so much, Binge, for sponsoring the event. Before we go further, we actually have a clip from Binge, which we might play now. Can we do that, please?
There's no halfway with this.
We do not press pause.
So give them what they love.
Maybe things would be better if you saw somebody else.
You can't control who you fall in love with. No one can.
Excited to get with this knife fight?
Let's blow it up.
You want to clear the air? You're a snake.
You have hurt me more than you could possibly imagine.
I'm very attracted to you.
Oh.
Would you be interested in having an affair? You're a mess. You've always been a mess.
After one night with you, I couldn't stop thinking about you. You saved my life. Oh my god. I hit it, dog.
Oh my god!
One swing. Don't get caught.
And just like that, hello, lovers.
People, let's make the dream happen.
Thank you very much, and thank you all very much for coming. What a wonderful turnout. So this session, just make sure you're in the right session, is Funny Business, Australian comedy in the international market. The particular focus will be on Australian scripted comedy. Let me just jump in straight away, first of all, and introduce a wonderful panel that we've got, a very large panel. Let me start politely first with one of our speakers and our sponsor, Alison Herbert-Burns, who is the Executive Director of Binge. To her left is Sarah Freeman, outstanding producer of the enormous international hit Heartbreak High, but as well before that, the fantastic ABC and Netflix comedy series Why You Like This. To my immediate right is Emma Fitzsimons, who is the Managing Director of Princess Pictures, with credits too innumerable to mention. Won't mention them all, but is currently, of course, enjoying enormous international success with the various animated scripted comedies from creator Michael Cusack, including Koala Man, as well as Smiling Friends, YOLO, and many others. To her right is the great Kevin White, founder and managing director of Token Artists, but on top of an amazing live comedy business, one of the most prolific producers of both unscripted and scripted Australian comedy, with a particular focus on international, with many credits. Most immediately forthcoming very soon is the new Amazon series Deadlock, about which there'll be a full panel, I think that's tomorrow, but as well many other shows like Rosehaven, Get Crackin', and Please Like Me, Frayed, and a million others. And to his right is the great Todd Abbott, who was the producer of Please Like Me, but of course is now the head of comedy at the ABC. So please welcome our panel. So let me just jump in, and again, thank you all so much. Let me ask, first of all, the question. There's a bunch of these very successful, sort of a very prominent, internationally prominent, successful scripted comedy shows at the moment. Colin from Accounts, which is on Binge. There was Why You Like This. Heartbreak High has a comedic element. There's the Michael Cusack shows, Koala Man. Deadlock is forthcoming. Todd is as head of comedy oversees the immensely popular Fisk, which has done incredibly well internationally, received lots of international awards, including sweeping the big one at Series Mania. Is this just about and I don't mind who goes first, but is this just about those shows being terrific shows, or do you, as a panel, think that there is currently do you perceive there to be a pattern or a taste for international, in the international market for Australian scripted comedy that there wasn't before, or is this just about a bunch of great shows at the same time? I don't mind who wants to.
I think it's always about the shows. I think as much as it would be joyful to ride a wave, because it feels like a lot less work than actually having to make good things, ultimately it's always about the shows, and the shows that have found those international audiences have been good shows, which is good because it means our good stuff is seen by everyone.
Yeah, indeed. But Ali, what about you?
Yeah, I agree. I think there is a general trend with international audiences used to seeing content that isn't just from their home country. We see it here. We're watching things from more places and they're popular. So on that logic, there's no reason why they wouldn't have an appetite for Australian stuff. But I think the recent success is off the back of some really great ideas and some good shows.
Do you have a perspective on that, Emma?
So I think I'll answer just from the animation perspective, and I think there's been an enormous change. Australia hasn't really had any runs on the board in adult comedy, in animation, certainly lots of runs on the board for kids. So we've sort of seen a shift even in the last sort of 3 or 4 years of, pitching adult concepts coming out of Australia and being asked to, so could you set it in Miami? Could you set it in blah, blah, blah? Whereas now we don't get that. We do get it sometimes, but not nearly as much. So, and I think weirdly, things like Bluey in animation has changed a lot of the appetite. And then having a couple of runs on the board, YOLO's set in Australia, Koala Man is set in Australia, Smiling Friends is not, but it certainly has made the conversation very, very different.
Has the rest of the panel perceived a shift there, as Emma talks about, in terms of an increased willingness for shows out of Australia? Is that again just about good shows, or is that a newish phenomenon, do you think? The idea of sort of shows being from Australia versus needing to be originated out of Australia?
I think that there's definitely an international audience that find Australians cute. I say that working out of like the Gen Z kind of space, but I think I've found that with Heartbreak High and Why You Like This, it connected a lot because we're all experiencing the same things, I think, for a younger audience, for the kids growing up that are online. It's all the same themes and it's all the same things, so they're relating to that, and it's giving them an introduction to Australian shows, which I think helps make them more familiar with Australian shows, which then will hopefully encourage more of that, whereas I think before it might have felt a little bit foreign, particularly for that. I'm sort of speaking more for Gen Z audiences.
Yeah, I think... Yikes. Sorry. Well, I think it might actually be almost coming at it from the other angle, which is that there's not necessarily a perceptible hunger for shows from Australia, but the changing landscape of the way that people consume content internationally has meant that there is no longer a barrier or a barrier to or a fear of something being from Australia. So I think people are more open to things from any country, provided they're good shows.
So the sort of consensus is that there's not a particularly focused appetite on Australian shows so much as good shows, and it's perfectly fine if they come from Australia. But many of you on the panel have sold these shows internationally, have been intimately involved in that. Most of you have. Are you perceiving particular elements that international buyers are looking for just to assist? Is it about theme? Are they dependent on stars? Is it about on-screen talent being the creative drivers of the project, as in Colin of Accounts? Is it about the creative's track record? Are there other factors? Do you perceive sort of particular things that international buyers are particularly looking for when they look at the sort of Australian scripted shows that you're taking out internationally?
I can jump in on Colin. Last year when we launched Colin from Accounts to the market, it was at the LA screenings, and it was a funny screenings because there was a lot of the big studios weren't really selling a lot. You'd go to Disney and you'd see these shows and it's like, oh, we're putting it on our platform. But Paramount screened it at their day because CBS International were involved. It went out first thing in the morning and there wasn't a lot of other American content that they were selling. So it really got highlighted and spotlighted. And we sat, it was quite scary, and as a previous job in buying, you watch lots of other people's shows and pilots and you think, you're quick to judge, but we sat in an audience with 600 people on the Paramount lot and watched buyers from Benelux and Germany and the Scandi countries and New Zealand and lots of different countries watch Colin and watch that first episode, and it was like doing some research at the back. But the laughs happened in the same places, regardless of the nations that they were from, and in some places more than we thought. And the feedback we got on the ground was, this is the right time. People are exhausted after COVID, life is hard, and people wanted the joy and the comedy that came from the show. So I think for that one, it was really well positioned. CBS were great partners in that regard. They really pushed it forward on a global stage. But I think it's also the mood of not just the nation, but the mood of where audiences are.
Now, in the case of Colin from Accounts, and I want to go to this side too, but in the case of Colin from Accounts, you had two Australian performers who were, one of them particularly well known from Australian shows. Both of them had done American television, though at that point neither one of them was a huge American television or international TV star. But nevertheless, did you perceive that the fact that they had some recognition factor, did that make a difference to people's interest in the show or enjoyment of the show, or do you think that was just a byproduct of it being a good show?
I think it was a byproduct of being a good show. I mean, Harry is now doing American Auto, NBC network comedy. They've just finished season 2. Paddy had done a little bit more, but I think for them it was the awareness of them from CBS. They'd done No Activity with CBS. Trent was also attached as directing, so there was context and connection into America and the right kind of backers that came in to support the show. So that's probably where that made the biggest difference, rather than from a buyer's perspective, knowing them from other things.
It's an interesting point. I'd like to come back to that question about sort of buyers and what they're interested in. But what about on this side? In terms of when you're taking shows out, are there particular factors? I mean, how important for the shows you've taken out, Kevin and Emma, cast? How important, though, is it just about the track record of the creatives? Is it just about the concept? Are there patterns or themes that you can perceive from your experience?
Yeah, I mean, I think not every show is the same, obviously, but when we're taking out, especially an Australian comedy or Australian show where we are feeling like we're on the back foot, if we're taking it to America, trying to get buyers engaged there, then we will do things like look at how we package it. Do we add an EP? Do we add even ceremonially, do we try and pre-cast? Because we sort of become very conscious of that package that you're sending out there. This is, of course, selling before it's made, so it's harder. We're not showing people in a room a finished show. We do, in animation, we will do little teasers and presentations, and certainly lots and lots of art and a very established deck. In the end, it is about the talent for us taking those Australian shows over to those US buyers. Weirdly, we get told by some of the buyers here that if it's an Australian show, you have to bring it to the Australian reps of the streamers, whereas somehow animation seems to kind of get around that. So we're constantly pitching Australian-based, Australian IP to US buyers over there. So you do have to put a lot of thinking around that package. We don't always try and add a cast or an EP, but it definitely helps.
So in the case of Koala Man, you obviously, so the big, obviously there's a huge benefit to it having names attached like Hugh Jackman and Sarah Snook, but were they attached when you took it out, or it was really about Michael Cusack's voice that you were taking out?
Michael Cusack's voice and the support of Justin Roiland, who at the time was, one of the biggest adult animation creators in the world. Obviously things have changed for him a little bit. And even with Michael Cusack's voice, and even though we had a pilot, and even though we'd been working on it for years, they still, the sort of team that were taking it out still felt like we needed that security, that support around asking a network to take a risk on an Aussie animated show that never really happened before. So we sort of really bolstered up that pitch and that package to take it out, but not cast. And
Kevin, what about you? And Todd, I'm interested too. You've sold a lot of Australian scripted shows internationally. What's your perception about this question? What are the elements that people are looking for?
I think it's always different. It's such a boring answer. But at the end of the day, I always think of it in terms of I'm asking someone for several $1 million, which seems like a big favour. So on that basis, you've got to give them a good reason. So if you're walking in the room and you've got a great idea, but nobody that they know in that pitch and they don't know you, those things, you need to bolster it. You need to build it up. So you need to be walking in the room making a compelling case. If you've got a track history with that buyer and you can say, I found this funny, I found this really engaging, and you think that's going to be enough, then happy days. But often you might be walking in with if it's going to be really idea driven, you might be walking in with a deck and a script. You might invest that time prior before you go in there. It might need talent attachment. And if they don't know you as a producer, they might need a producing partner that they connect with and can trust. But at the end of the day, people get in quite a lot of trouble if they piss several $1 million up against the wall, so they tend to avoid it.
But when you're taking out your shows, how important to international buyers has it been, for example, that, as in the case of many of your shows, the people driving the show creatively are also, for example, on-screen talent? They've often not been stars prior to that point, but they've been excellent people who are both in the show and driving the show. How attractive or important to buyers has that been?
That has been important, particularly in Australia. Internationally, one of the things that's really helpful with that is that it's easier to make them fans of The Voice. You know, it's easier to make them, you know, in the case of Prime Video with Deadlock, the key buyers over in the US, we sold that in the US, they didn't have a base here at the time, were fans. They'd seen the catering show, they'd seen Get Crackin', they thought it was funny, they wanted that. And then it was helped by the fact that the show is in a murder mystery genre. So genre helps as well. So you got the story guardrails of genre, so they could see how you could get from, you know, a crazy morning show to a satirical morning show to, you know, a substantially more expensive kind of endeavour in an 8x1 hour. And that was genre that helped that.
I want to come back in a moment, thank you, Kevin, to the question of subject matter. But Todd, do you have a perspective on this in terms of when you talk to international buyers about the possibility of doing shows together? Are there particular elements of Australian shows that they're interested in from your perspective?
I think sometimes it's just the fact that Australian creators will sometimes just go to places that they're not expecting. You know, certainly when we sold Please Like Me, well, Kevin did all the heavy lifting in selling Please Like Me, you know, to Holly Hines, who was at Pivot. May or may not be in the room, but she's here at this conference. You know, one of the things that consistently kept coming up was that the way that Josh was writing that show and some of the things that we did in that show were just things that were not happening on American television. You know, one of the shows that we've got coming up very soon, which is produced by the wonderful Linda Uyok over in the front here, is Gold Diggers. And similarly, that's with CBS Studios, who also, of course, did Colin. And the thing that excites them about is just, you know, a sort of Broad City meets Deadwood, feminist revisionist history of the gold rush with a virginal sister and a slut sister, both trying to find dumb, rich husbands in the goldfields, is not something they're pitched every day. So, you know, and the feedback that keeps coming back on that from them is that they're just astounded by that storytelling, and that doesn't have, you know, particularly big, well-known international stars in its lead. They're great. Claire and Danielle are sensational, but yeah, it didn't need the attachment of that. It's just a great concept by Jack Yabsley and very, very funny scripts.
We talked before, a couple of times now, has come up the question of, you know, different shows need different things to sell them. In the case of Gold Diggers, I remember that the sort of the proof of concept for that had been around for a couple of years, in fact, with different people attached. How, in the case of Gold Diggers, was that a feature? Was that what was taken to CBS? Do you know what attracted them? Was it just a script, or was it that video? All
of the above, says Linda.
Right.
Yeah.
And what about the rest of the panel and sort of taking things out? What have you... I want to ask in a minute about... Well, we can talk about it now, in fact. What are you finding that at what point are you finding international buyers will come into something? And does it depend on the show? What about, in the case of animation, I imagine is a bit sui generis. What did you take out in terms of the animated material to sell an animated scripted show?
Look, weirdly, generally you don't have a script. That's one big difference with live action comedy, where we always go out with a script. In the case of Koala Man, we did have a script, but we are constantly pitching projects from Australia without a script, and that's normal animation. But instead of a script, you have invested a lot of time and energy into creating the world and the characters, and you'll sort of... The time you might have put into the script is put instead into the art and the design and the world building and all of that. So weirdly, with animation, no script.
But you have animes and examples and all that sort of stuff.
Oh, yeah.
What about in the case of the non-animated sort of projects? Are buyers coming in only once there is a script? What are you finding as a group?
Again, I think it depends. And Ali might and Tom would know this as buyers, but I find it depends on the reputation of the creator, and it depends on how much capital and how much enthusiasm there is for the creator. But I think increasingly there's just not rules. We're sometimes bringing things to a buyer to essentially get a trigger sale in Australia, and then we're going to go find the rest of the money. Sometimes we're taking it to a studio player who might be taking out everything. There's always that fine line. You want to be able to take out a script so that people can see the tone of voice, but you also, different platforms have got slightly nuanced requirements. So this is one of those things that internally, both as managers and also as producers, we wrestle with on a project by project basis. But we tend to find that people want something tangible and something solid and something they can really hang their hat on. If it's a great creator with a really great idea that they've got a great track history with, then maybe they'll take it from a pitch. If it's short of that, then they're probably going to want to see words on a page or a taster, whatever it might be.
Interesting. From my recollection, if I have it right, when you took Deadlock to Amazon, although you had these wonderful creators who had a strong track record and people were interested in it internationally, there also was a script, wasn't there?
There was a script. And that can also be, I'm sure other people have got other development examples they've got. Sometimes you need to get stuck into that first episode to get things beyond theoretical, so sometimes you need to actually kind of tear at the gristle of the script. And we've certainly had cases where we've done a script, popped it in the drawer and made a deck from the things we learnt from the script.
So was that really why those two women were doing the script? Was that for themselves or was it as a selling tool?
It's a big jump to go from, and I can't talk entirely to what the Kates were thinking, but at the time it was as much about working out, is this a world we want to play in? Do we... can we, and I think they've done it amazingly, blend comedy and mystery and intrigue and those genres. They wanted to be able to work that out without necessarily having anyone looking over their shoulder.
Alison, Ali, what's your experience with when you've dealt with international sort of co-buyers and so forth? What have you found that at what point are they interested in coming in?
Yeah, well, from our perspective, firstly, when we're making something, from Australia, as commissioners, we do take things at varying stages of development and idea. It really is case by case, as Kev said. Colin from Accounts specifically, we had a number of scripts. We had a strong pilot and the first few episodes. Harriet had written this as an idea, kind of first thing she'd ever written, a few years before, and then had been working on it with Patrick. So it was quite unique because it came with a lot of structure already around it. We didn't have to go into development rooms, and the two of them wrote it together as well. So it wasn't a normal kind of writer's room approach either. But so, yeah, for local things that we're doing case by case, we will work with people and do development and get it to a point where we're really in at the beginning and shaping it together. And then from international buyers, we often hear from our partners that having a lead commissioner and a strong platform in Australia then helps them unlock the next level of conversations, gives them confidence and connection and a pathway to fund. which is why we often, are out first and front on projects, and then the next step happens overseas.
So the focus of this panel is the international market, but that is a question that I wanted to ask you all. Is it your working assumption that you will always get an Australian partner on board as well, or first, or are you now increasingly taking things directly internationally?
For live action, I don't know your world, but for live action, I think it's you can have a preliminary conversation, but I think it's a pretty hard ask if you don't have a local buyer. Particularly if you're pitching to companies that don't have a presence on the ground in Australia, just on a practical level, the production supervision piece, they don't know how to approve personnel, so they do need that anchor tenant, and it's hard when you're taking it out. If what you're doing, unless you're selling to a studio, but if you're taking it out to put together the finance for multiple partners, again, there's no rules to this, but as a generalisation, it's pretty hard to say you're going to be able to sell this to the world if you can't sell it at home.
Yeah.
So,
and how often are you being approached with things where you're being asked to come in first on what's proposed to be an internationally co-produced show, or are you being brought shows which already have an international partner on board? I mean, how often is that happening with you as the head of comedy?
No, I think people are, I think Australian producers are getting pretty wise to that being, a much more guaranteed path to being commissioned. It's a pretty regular part of the pitch.
But you don't need it. I mean, in your case, you'll, I assume, commission shows without an international partner if it's a show that you love.
Yeah, but, increasingly, we all know how much production costs are spiralling. Realistically, that probably means that we're approaching a point where we are going to have to make fewer shows or stretch that dollar out by having international partners. So, it's increasingly important.
So that comes back to a question that I wanted to ask at the start, but it makes sense to ask now, which is, in your minds now as both producers and buyers and sellers, respectively, of international scripted comedy, Australian scripted comedies in the international market, is there any such thing anymore for you as a local show? Or in your minds, when you're putting shows together, is everything now needed to be financed internationally or partly internationally?
I think you'd be pretty stitched up budget-wise if it was probably just local. Like, I just think those crew rates, what we're all trying to achieve, trying to make shows that do break out internationally, it needs decent development. It needs proper, resources behind it. So I think it's increasingly hard, and I kind of wonder how, a lot of kids' shows and smaller budget productions are actually making it, work at the moment, because we're up against it, having crew rates and other types of things bigger than they ever have been and bigger than we've, expected. So it doesn't sound like, if you want to make, the shows we want to make, that you could do that with just the money you could get here.
Ali, will you, factoring in the reality now of sort of production costs, crew costs, will Binge meet those costs if it loves the show without an international partner, or how important is an international partner to you?
I can't remember the last time Binge and the Foxtel Group did a scripted project that didn't have distributor advances and international money coming into it to make it work. Unscripted's a little bit different, but I think for us as well, it's case by case. There's not a cookie cutter approach of this is what we put in and that's the rule and we won't do anything more. We'll look at equity, we'll look at other things when we really believe in something, or extra costs that we need to to help cover to get it right. But I think as we've said, the ambition, and from the Binge audience perspective, they are watching, as you saw on that opening sizzle, with our originals mixed in, but they are watching some of the best shows from around the world, from England, from Europe, from the US. So their expectations are for that type of content. And when we're commissioning, we're going, this person's going to finish watching White Lotus, and we launch Colin from Accounts out the back of White Lotus. Anyone that watched White Lotus on Binge was getting served up a Colin promo at the end of it, and we had this built-in kind of demand building for it. So our ambition has to meet those levels, and I think that will require international funding. So we have jigsaw puzzles and different approaches. It's case by case, but it's a requirement, and we have to work together. And from a platform locally, when it's not a Heartbreak High example or a global Netflix or Paramount approach, we put a lot of time ourselves developing relationships with other broadcasters. We really work on, we have dates and slate times that work for us, but we'll be flexible and work with partners so that we can get the best global considerations into it. Is it best to all go at the one date, or sometimes we'll go first and it'll follow, which is the example of Colin. But we're constantly having to do things and look at them and evolve as the market changes.
This was touched on earlier, but I want to sort of jump into the question of sort of the development process and development experience when you're dealing with international buyers. I'd be interested in the whole panel's perspective. You've all done these shows, as we've talked about. How different is the experience dealing with international buyers during the development process? Are they, I'm just making this up now, are they more or less hands-on? Are there cultural gaps that need to be bridged, differences of taste? What are those experiences like, and how do you manage them? And are they a problem or are they not a problem? Todd, what about you? You've done these shows, which are quite a lot of international co-productions.
There was one point where we were required to lessen the bulge in Tom Ward's underpants in Please Like Me because the American network deemed that it was a bit too risque for them. That's largely what happened. Really, that's probably, to be honest, the biggest difference of opinion that I think we had. There was certainly nothing, and look, certainly in the process of what we're doing at the moment with Gold Diggers, you would be surprised, or maybe not surprised, at just how consistent the notes are on from all parties. I think it probably goes back to my earlier answer about the expectations that people have now of the shows that they're watching, which is that, I think we probably had an assumption that there is an American network standard, and, American audiences and executives are now very much used to watching things from a much broader, range of sources, and therefore those pretty kind of limited standards of American network TV have changed.
Sarah, what about you? You've now done two sort of big shows, with one directly with Netflix and one both with Australia and with Netflix. Did you have much international input as distinct from Australian Netflix input on Heartbreak High, and how different were those comments?
We have a See You Next Tuesday cap per episode that we're allowed to say. So that's... I don't know. I think you'll have to watch and then you can guess what the cap is. The cap. No, I think, for Why You Like This, they were pretty hands-off because it was sort of ABC and Netflix as well. I think for both experiences of those shows, what they resonated with were sort of the more international, or universal themes that connected, but they were all up for the Australian specificity of the shows, and I think that's what made it really special. So that often, we'd get asked a lot of questions. What's an essay? What's,
what is an essay, by the way?
Is
that a session?
It does stand, it's short for sesh, but it's like those guys in tracksuit pants who hang at the train station and might bash you.
Right. That's an essay?
That's an essay.
It's a person, not a thing.
It's a person.
Right, there we
go.
It's
a style, it's a lifestyle.
Thank you. If you take nothing else from this session, you've learned what that means now. Emma, what about you? Sorry, I want to come to Kevin too, because Kevin's on heaps. But Emma, you're having this experience now, which you talked about before. You're doing animated shows directly for American buyers. You felt the need sometimes to attach an American EP. What's the experience been like in terms of understanding cultural gaps, all those kinds of things with the Cusack stuff, which is very Australian?
Yes, very Australian. It's boring to say again, but depends. It can depend on the buyer. Adult Swim, we find, are much less hands-off, but they want that pure Cusack voice for his shows. When we were doing Koala Man, we had both 20th and Hulu as the buyer, and they were no more hands-on than an Australian buyer, I would have thought. What was different is we had a 20-week writer's room. which of course we'd never get here. And then again, another week here and there to do extra punch-ups, and a big team of writers all working on their scripts, as well as having that really long development period. So that was huge for us. And I think, the Australian writers found that quite an incredible thing to be involved in. It was all done by Zoom, because, can be nowadays. So yeah, it just depends, Rick. Sorry.
What about the American showrunners that were involved with Cusack's shows? How was that process difficult for him? Because he is very much sort of a lone wolf operator, sort of historically. He animated it all himself, wrote it, voiced it. Was that a challenge for him? Was that a problem? Was it never a problem?
I haven't asked him exactly that question, but in terms of how it all, they were so respectful of his voice and vision, and they wanted to do the show because they loved him. So, as far as I understood, it was a really harmonious, incredibly creative partnership, and they came out with something they were really proud of. So,
yeah, what about you? Has this experience been positive largely for you?
It's been largely positive. It's actually interesting, Todd, bringing up Please Like Me, because that was 2014. It was ages ago. And I do remember with that show, and I wonder whether this is kind of like a bit of a time capsule, there was a lot more anxiety around translation. There was a lot more anxiety around, will people get this world? Will people get these characters? Will they get the language? So there were a lot of conversations about Bulges. There were a lot of conversations about lube, but there was a lot more anxiety about that, and I feel like that's kind of faded away. And I think what's probably significant is that show was made for basic cable in the US. So our partner in the US was a cable network, a short-lived cable network, but a cable network nonetheless. So I think as television itself has become more international, I feel like they want to see those distinctive voices. People do kind of bump up against expressions and where people genuinely don't understand things and it feels important for story and you're not getting there on inference, then you change it. But I would struggle to come up with an example of actually changing something for that lost in translation. What Emma said is right, though. You do get, when you got that international piece in there is generally more time for development.
You mentioned Please Like Me. Sorry, you mentioned Please Like Me. And I recall I worked on that show when it was season 2. Season 1 had already been made and just come out. I recall being told that initially, though, it's interesting, you said time capsule, that participants' first thought was how could they remake the show? And they probably wouldn't think that now, wouldn't ask that question of themselves now, but they did then, and that wasn't that long ago.
It was going to be a remake initially, and they didn't have the time. Basically, they wanted it to premiere. They wanted it to be part of the launch. So we ended up with some help from some partners in America, pushing them towards let's just buy it.
Right. So it was less about them reaching a conclusion that only Josh Thomas's voice could be behind the show?
Josh probably would have travelled with the show, so we probably would have had Josh performing so that it just would have ended up, and again, thank God we don't have these conversations anymore, but it would have been that thing of twisting ourselves in knots for a reason for his character to all of a sudden be in America, like he's a college student or something like that.
Well, you really used to notice it. It used to be excruciating. You'd see shows even 5 years ago where there was a 9-hour explanation about why there was an English guy in LA, and now there's just an English person in LA, right?
Yeah.
Alison, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off before. You were going to say something about this.
I was just going to say, I think it depends as well. Like, if it's a co-pro, there's obviously a little bit more coming together and balancing of voices. But I think when it's an international buyer coming on and, they're treating it really as an acquisition, they want to see a strong authored show, and, you've got then less juggling to do with the amount of creatives that are having a voice at the table. So I think they're not all as complicated. Often, they're buying them as something that's finished. It's not always in at the early stage.
I should say, in a couple of minutes, in about 5 minutes, we're going to have the opportunity for some questions, Q&A. I've been told to tell you that there are either through the app, you can find the Q&A section. There should also be, I think, potentially a QR code that may or may not pop up, which you can scan as a means of asking questions. They will then come through to me on an iPad, I was pleased to learn, and hopefully that will work. We'll do that in about 5 minutes. In fact, there is the QR code. Great, on cue. Before we get to that, I just wanted to ask then, and I think we've talked about this a bit, have these particularly notable sort of international shows out of Australia, scripted comedy shows, do you feel they're going to are they changing the game for, do you think either for the ease of selling shows, is that going to change and get easier or not? But also, has that changed the game? How does that change the game for you as producers and producers and sellers?
Selling to one person and then paying for everything is demonstrably easier than selling to multiple people. Just being glib about it, but it's also kind of a fact. But I also do think that there are often, not always, but there are often creative benefits to having those shared voices and having more than one stakeholder. We've certainly had experiences where when you're getting notes of feedback from more than one party, if you're inclined to ignore it, but everyone saw the same problem, then maybe it makes it a bit easier for you to swallow kind of taking a look.
But in terms of sort of the pathway for future shows, do you feel like these shows might potentially create a greater appetite for Australian shows for the international market, or is it a case of what you all said earlier, which is it's just always going to be about the right show at the right time?
I think anything we can do that, the example of CBS, and they've had a good experience in Australia. This has worked well. They're here. They're investing in other things. I think the more proof points we can have and ways into the country to show how we're collaborating will help the next ones as they go forward for sure.
Absolutely, it will change. I think there's been so many great Australian comedies out in the last 4 or 5 years. Upright, Frayed, all of those ones, Bump, that have done really well, and now the current ones. I do think it's changed the conversation, and I do think it will be. Having said that, apart from all the current issues with the financing shows and streamers having to cut costs, other than that, yes, I do think the conversation is very different now.
Is that your perception, Kevin? Do you still think it's going to be about? Do you think it's going to get? Will it be easier, or do you think it's still going to be about great shows?
It's always about great shows, but the process of selling is a trust exercise ultimately. So, if a buyer, it's very. I don't think I've ever been in a situation where I'm sitting in front of an actual billionaire pitching a show who's going to, just put it on their Amex. When you're selling a show, you're asking the executive to be your advocate. They're going to have to go into the organisation and they're going to have to tell people why it's great. And yeah, if they can point to track history within that company or at other companies where shows from this market and also maybe shows that maybe share creative kind of engines have been successful, that all helps the case.
Todd, what's your perspective as a person who's buying Australian shows but also dealing with shows that potentially are co-productions? Do you feel like the sort of pathway for shows that you, for example, might want to commission that might need an international buyer, are you feeling that's getting easier? Is it staying the same? What's your perception?
No, I agree with what everyone else has just said, is that, it is about building that trust, and it's certainly easier for us to reach out to, I can't believe I used the word reach out, I hate that, but I just did it. So it's much easier for us to make contact with people that we now have really great relationships with, at networks and production companies internationally, because, as Kevin said, it's trust. They know that Australian producers will deliver. So yeah, certainly that's easier. I mean, presumably in the next 3 to 6 months, there might be a very increased appetite for Australian programs.
In the next 3 to 6 months, for about 3 to 6 months.
Yeah, that's right.
I might ask one last question before we go to questions and answers, which is about sort of lessons you've learned, both good and bad, from your experience historically, recently in selling shows internationally, being involved in international co-productions. What do you feel, if you're prepared to share, what have you done right? What did you do wrong that you wouldn't do again? What have been the sort of the big experiences or lessons that you've taken with you from the last few years? Sarah, what about you?
I know you prepped us for this question, but I was like, I don't know what I can say. Look, I think for what I've found is it's the pathways to try and find our audience, and I feel like that has been obviously really helpful with Netflix, but I think sort of the further discussion and sort of what I think about is when we're talking about shows that are going to be more, or start more Australian based, it's like sort of how we're getting to those places. And I felt like a show like Why You Like This, which I'm super proud of, it took a while for people to find it or to be able to access it, particularly because it was for an audience that isn't as it's Gen Z. They don't watch a lot of broadcast television and they don't watch a lot of ABC. So that was a really big challenge to try and get them. And the show didn't come out on Netflix for another year. So we sort of sat in this limbo with building all this press and good, work for the show. But it's really hard when you don't have those direct pathways and you don't have those kind of marketing publicity tools behind you. Whereas something like Heartbreak High that was straight out on Netflix, we automatically had that reach. We had the IP, so it was just so much easier to start that conversation. And we realised that the young kids who also still don't watch a lot of things either found out about it because their parents told them to watch it or because someone told them to watch it on TikTok. So, yeah.
Alison, what about you?
I think it's in terms of lessons and what you do again. You've got to back these things when you're, and as the producers on the panel would know that because they're the ones driving it forward. But just believing in it and getting out of the way of it, but supporting and nurturing it as well. So take some swings. You've got to take some bets and keep pushing the bar forward.
You guys, what about you three? Sort of things you would do differently, or things that you or brave decisions you made that paid off? What do you have sort of particular things you want to mention?
I might be a tired old hack, so I might be resistant to change, but I always kind of remind myself that these are a big prize. Getting to make a TV show, particularly, I kind of spent my whole life in comedy, so being able to get, one of our artists to be able to have their own show is such a big prize, and it's so exciting. It requires building so much trust, so much advocacy, such a kind of a community around an idea, that it's right that it's hard. I wish it was easy, but it's kind of right that it's hard. They're unreal when you get to do them. And they take a lot of trust, a lot of commitment, and you kind of need to build a family around a show. So taking your time, having those conversations has kind of gone nowhere. As much as the buyers have changed and the finance structures have changed, and the development pathway has changed, the same strategy still applies. You've got to make people love your idea as much as you do, which probably also means that before you take an idea out there, you've got to be pretty convinced you love it because you're going to be living with it for a while.
Emma, Todd?
I'll very quickly, because Emma, I'm sure, will have something way more useful to say than I have. But I would say if you get the chance to work with the head of casting for CBS, Meg Lieberman, you should take it because she's incredible.
That's good. Emma, positive, negative experiences or things you would do differently or the things you would keep doing?
I think our experience with bringing this new wave of Aussie IP in animation to the world has been incredible and very exciting and sort of has gone beyond what we anticipated. And I can't really think of any lessons, Rick, sorry. The buyers are still hungry for it as far as we're experiencing. It's great. It's a good time to be in thinking of those concepts. Anyone got those? Come and see us.
I think I've exhausted everyone with my questions, but we do have a few questions from the audience. I might just throw them out. The first one is actually, again, about adult animation. So I guess for Emma, for you, the question is, are buyers looking, in your experience, for more borderline extreme concepts, or is that just a reflection of what Cusack's doing? I mean, what's your experience there?
Depends on the buyer. No, I would say most buyers are still looking for for shows that are really appealing to the broader audience and not niche. Some of the buyers are an exception to that, but generally they want, a family sitcom. It's the same, even if it was a network show. It's the family. It's less about the high concept. It's more about the family and the fun stuff that happens.
Someone else asked this question. They've written, comedy can be so subjective. How do you navigate a very broad spectrum of humour when you're choosing a project that you think is appropriate to take out to the international market?
I can do that. Comedy is subjective. Comedy is obviously subjective, but it still needs to be funny to enough people. Like, there's subjective and there's subjective. It still needs to be funny to enough people that it's going to find an audience. Because if you can't find an audience, so there's, there's. Everyone's, obviously there's been all the conversations around Barry Humphries over the last couple of weeks. Comedy can be really divisive, and comedy can breed fierce loyalty, and people can really kind of be up in arms about things. But ultimately, you need to find a fan, is what it comes down to. At the end of the day, if someone doesn't laugh at some point during your pitch, they're probably not going to buy the show.
Well, there are people who love comedy who are not laughers in rooms, though, aren't there?
There are, but they're kind of assholes. That's not... Like, that's actually being a bit of a fucking monster. But yes, I do know that.
Yeah. This may be a little bit unorthodox. I'm not meant to do it, but I kind of wonder if there might be some more questions that people want to ask. They might feel more comfortable about just sort of putting a hand up about for a couple of minutes. We've got a little bit of time. Has anyone else got another question they wanted to ask for the panel? All right. Well, look, on that basis, I'm just going to keep an eye on these. We have a little bit of time. But I think we're coming to the end. I wanted to thank the whole panel for a really interesting session, very sort of process and sort of sales driven, but that's what this session is meant to be about, rather than, war stories. But I guess I wanted to have sort of, if I want to invite each member of the panel maybe just to sort of have sort of a final thought on selling to the international market, what has been the sort of how would I put it, what has been sort of the greatest thrill about it, what has been the greatest challenge? Sarah, I might start with you.
Okay. I think the greatest thrill about it is still sort of honouring the shows you want to make and the Australian things you want to do, and not sort of trying to broaden your show or flatten it out for people. Like, I think that's actually what makes it special, and when you get that right, it actually does connect internationally. So I'd hate for people to be fearful that they need to change their shows any other way to sort of make it more accessible, when I think people are looking for uniqueness and specificity, and that's what we can do.
Alison, what about you? Greatest thrill about sort of doing these shows on an international level, and what have you found the greatest sort of challenges, if you found any big challenges?
Look, I think the greatest thrill is seeing the shows and the ideas that start off find an audience. So the thrill and the experience from Colin from Accounts is it's become the most watched original in the history of the Foxtel Group. That's partly because we've grown so much in the last few years with Binge. We've got now Binge and Foxtel, so we've never had a bigger audience. For those that want to pitch to us, there's plenty of people hungry to see this stuff. So it's amazing to see something go that broad. And I think just recently seeing when it does travel, and to Sarah's point about the authenticity of it and the voice of it, this really authored voice in Colin, is that it travels. So sitting there last year and watching buyers from around the world laugh at our Australianness was fab, but to see it take off as it has in the last few weeks in the UK, and what that will do for Patrick and Harriet and everyone attached to the show, is really pleasing to see, because you want to see success locally, but if that then creates opportunities for Australian producers to take their projects to a global scale, that's success.
Emma, what about you?
We get pitched a lot of comedy concepts for animation that it's really clear they were developed for live action. And we can get these scripts coming, make a great animation. And I just wanted to sort of, one thing we've really learned is that you can tell that, can smell that a mile off. So for us, it's, those sort of triple threat creators, the ones that are artists and writers and are performers. They're like the holy grail. But if you can do two of those things, then we definitely want to speak to creators like that. But what you don't necessarily realise when you're making live action TV is that you can't just go, you know, that live action show, I couldn't quite get finance, maybe it can be an animation. It just can't. So, so that's my helpful advice, hopefully. You should, if you're not an artist and you have an animated concept, then find an artist and develop it with them from the ground up organically.
Kevin, sort of biggest sort of thrills about international co-production of your shows, challenges?
I did the nice soulful one before, so the kind of thing about loving your work. So I'll do something more craven. Having an FYC billboard on Sunset is fucking unreal, and you should do that.
Was that for Hannah Gadsby?
Yeah. Yeah.
For the special, for
Nanette.
For Nanette, yeah, that was not bad. Yeah, she's got a big future, that kid. She's
a good kid. She's got a bright future. Keep an eye out for her.
Good.
Yeah.
Her, Mozart, and McCartney, they're my big 3 picks. Yeah, great, big future. Todd.
I mean, on the same point, you're lying if you say you don't get in this business to go to lunch at the Chateau Marmont. You know, and when you get to do that, it's really fucking great.
Yeah. There is a point at which this is show business. It's supposed to be fun. Yeah, billboards and nice lunches are unreal and should not be discounted or taken for granted.
Nice place to finish. Please, thank you all for coming. Thank you, Binge, for sponsoring. Thank you all for being here. Please thank our panel, Sarah Freeman, Alison Herbert-Burns, Emma Fitzsimons, Kevin White, Todd Abbott.